Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Alabama. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested to know to what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The summer of 1841 in Montgomery County, Alabama, was particularly suffocating. Not just from the heat that seemed to press down like a physical weight, but from something else, something that hung in the air over the Web Plantation like an invisible shroud. The grand house on Tallahassee Road stood 3 miles east of Montgomery proper, its white columns gleaming in the distance, visible even from the muddy banks of the Alabama River, a symbol of prosperity that masked a foundation built on cruelty. By all accounts, Josiah Webb was considered a respectable figure in Montgomery society, a landowner whose cotton yields consistently ranked among the county's highest. His twice-yearly trips to the Montgomery Exchange building to sell his harvest were the stuff of local legend. The man carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. When he rode through town in his polished carriage, people stepped aside, not just out of respect, but something closer to fear. According to county records from 1841, the Web Plantation housed 48 enslaved persons. Their names appear in the estate inventory as property, listed alongside furniture and livestock. But there was one name that would later appear in documents of an entirely different nature. Judicial records that survive today only in fragments, stored in the Alabama Department of Archives and History since 1963, when an assistant archivist discovered them in a damaged box of miscellaneous court papers. That name was Solomon. The Montgomery Advertiser from October 1841 makes only a passing reference to unusual proceedings at the Webb estate, but letters between neighboring plantation owners tell a different story. A letter from Thomas Beauregard to his brother in Mobile, dated September 28, 1841, notes, "Webb's place has fallen into a strange silence. They say he hasn't been seen in town for nearly 2 weeks. His overseer, that McHenry fellow, came to borrow salt, but wouldn't answer direct questions. Something isn't right there." Court records indicate that Josiah Webb had purchased Solomon in 1838 from a trader in New Orleans. The bill of sale describes Solomon as approximately 26 years of age, strong constitution, literate. That last detail, unusual enough to be noted, would prove significant. Solomon's literacy, something forbidden by law but clearly known to Webb, suggested he had been previously owned by someone who had either deliberately taught him or failed to prevent him from learning. What happened on the Webb Plantation that August remains a matter of conflicting accounts. The overseer's journal, recovered from a locked drawer in the estate office, offers only clinical observations about crop conditions and work assignments. But on August 19th, the handwriting changes. The entries become shorter, more stilted. One simply reads, "Master Webb requires silence in the house. All are to maintain distance." According to testimony later given by Eliza, the cook at the main house, Webb had begun to act strangely after receiving a letter in early August. He read it while sitting at the dining table, she told investigators, and his hand began to shake so bad he dropped his coffee cup. It shattered on the floor, but he just stared at that paper like he'd seen death itself. No one knows the contents of that letter. It was never found. What we do know comes from piecing together fragments. The physician's notes, statements from neighboring planters who eventually intervened, and most tellingly, the journal that was discovered hidden beneath a floorboard in the quarters where Solomon had been housed. The journal, written in a steady, practiced hand on scraps of paper sewn together, begins with a single line. "There are words that can break a man, even a man who believes himself unbreakable." Solomon had been assigned to work in the main house, Unusual for a male slave on the plantation, his duties included maintaining Webb's correspondence and reading aloud newspapers and agricultural reports. This position gave him access to Webb's private study and to secrets that Webb had perhaps assumed would never be understood by someone he considered property. From Solomon's hidden journal, entry dated July 28, 1841. Today I found the letters. They are exactly where he thinks they are safe, behind the false panel in the desk drawer. His entire fortune, his standing, everything would collapse if Montgomery society knew the truth. The nature of this truth is suggested, but never explicitly stated in the surviving documents. References in Solomon's journal point to financial improprieties involving several prominent Montgomery families, possible fraud in land acquisitions, and something more personal, what Solomon refers to only as the arrangement with Mrs. K. Historians have speculated this may refer to Catherine Kingsley, the widow of a prominent judge who died under questionable circumstances in 1839. What follows in the historical record is a subtle shift in power. Solomon's journal entries track a careful, deliberate campaign, not of direct confrontation, but something far more devastating, the strategic deployment of knowledge. From Solomon's journal, August 3rd, he noticed today that the papers had been disturbed. He looked at me, and for the first time, I did not lower my eyes. I maintained my gaze until he looked away first. Something has changed between us now. He knows that I know. The psychological weight of this knowledge began to manifest physically in Webb. The plantation physician, Dr. William Seaborn, visited the estate on August 10th and noted, Mr. Webb appears greatly agitated, complains of inability to sleep, startles at small sounds, pulse rapid and irregular, prescribed laudanum for nerves, though suspect the ailment may not be entirely physical in nature. The most chilling aspect of Solomon's strategy appears in his August 15th entry. I say nothing. I do nothing that could justify punishment. I simply exist in his space, carrying his knowledge. Each morning when I bring his coffee, I place it exactly 2 inches from where he expects it. When I lay out his clothes, I arrange them just slightly differently than the day before. He knows these are not mistakes, and he cannot say a word about it without revealing that he knows that I know. As August turned to September, the Web Plantation underwent a transformation that neighbors began to notice. Webb stopped attending church services in Montgomery. He declined dinner invitations. Deliveries were turned away at the gate by McHenry, the overseer, who, according to delivery logs, appeared increasingly anxious himself. From a letter written by Webb's sister in Selma, dated September 12th. My dear brother has not responded to my last 3 correspondences, which is entirely unlike him. I have half a mind to travel to Montgomery myself to determine what has caused this withdrawal. Inside the plantation, a silent psychological war continued. Solomon maintained his careful, subtle pressure, while Webb deteriorated. Dr. Seaborn's notes from September 5th indicate that Webb was by then refusing to eat any food prepared in the house, insisting on consuming only items he selected and prepared himself. The doctor wrote, "Patient exhibits signs of extreme paranoia. Claims someone is moving objects in his room when he isn't looking. Says he feels constantly watched. When I suggested this might be imagination, he became agitated and insisted I not speak of it again. His physical condition deteriorates not from disease but from self-neglect." By mid-September, Webb had confined himself to his study. According to testimony from house servants, he slept in his chair rather than his bedroom, kept a loaded pistol on his desk, and spoke to no one except to issue the most basic of commands. The plantation operations had effectively been abandoned to McHenry, who was increasingly drinking heavily, according to supply records showing unusual quantities of whiskey being purchased. Solomon's journal entry from September 18th. Today, He called me into his study. His hands trembled as he held the papers, the original letters I had discovered. He asked me in a voice barely above a whisper what I wanted. It was the first acknowledgement of our silent conversation. I told him I wanted what could never be given back to me, the years, the dignity, the family I had been torn from. He looked at me as if truly seeing a human being for the first time. Then he wept. I'd never seen a white man weep before. What happened next transformed the Web Plantation forever. According to property records on September 25, 1841, Josiah Webb began the process of manumission for Solomon. But the document was never completed. On the night of September 26th, a fire broke out in the main house. The Montgomery Advertiser reported on September 28th. Tragic fire at the Webb estate. J. Webb, prominent planter, perished. Investigation ongoing. The investigation, conducted by the county sheriff and 3 prominent planters appointed by the court, concluded that the fire had started in Webb's study. But testimony from survivors suggested something more complex had occurred before the flames erupted. From the testimony of Martha, a house servant, Master Webb had called everyone to the main parlor. Everyone, field hands, house servants, even the children. It wasn't done, having all of us in the house like that. He stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at us all gathered. He held papers in his hand. Solomon stood beside him, not behind him, as would be proper. Master Webb looked terrible sick, like he hadn't slept in days. His voice shook when he said he had an announcement to make. What announcement Webb intended to make remains unknown. According to multiple testimonies, before he could speak, McHenry burst into the house with a shotgun, shouting accusations of betrayal. In the chaos that followed, oil lamps were knocked over, and the dry wooden structure caught fire quickly. Solomon's final journal entry, dated September 26th. Tonight, everything changes. He has agreed to read the truth aloud before everyone. The words that have been hidden will finally be spoken. After that, whatever comes, at least the truth will be known. The fire consumed most of the main house. Webb's body was recovered from the study, though reports differ on whether he died from the flames or from a gunshot wound. McHenry's body was never found. In the aftermath, something extraordinary happened. The Web Plantation, instead of being sold off to cover debts as was common practice, was declared in legal limbo. Court records from October 1841 show a series of competing claims on the property, from Webb's sister in Selma, from business partners in Montgomery, and most significantly, from creditors who suddenly appeared with documentation suggesting that Webb's financial empire had been built on borrowed money and false representations. According to records in the Montgomery County Courthouse, the estate remained tied up in litigation for nearly 7 years. During this time, a highly unusual situation developed. The formerly enslaved people of the Web Plantation remained on the land, effectively governing themselves while producing just enough cotton to justify the property's continued operation. Solomon disappears from official records after the fire. No body was recovered that matched his description. A single reference in an 1843 letter from a neighboring planter mentions the educated Negro from Webb's place being spotted on a steamboat heading north up the Mississippi, though this was never verified. By 1848, the Webb estate was officially dissolved, the land parceled out to satisfy creditors. The enslaved people were technically part of the estate assets, but historical records show that many had already disappeared, either escaping north during the years of legal limbo or blending into the free black communities that existed tenuously in Montgomery and Birmingham. The Web Plantation house was never rebuilt. The land where it stood eventually became part of a different estate, then later was subdivided for smaller farms after the Civil War. By 1960, the exact location of the original main house had been lost to memory, reclaimed by pine forest. In 1958, during construction of a highway extension near the original plantation site, workers uncovered a small metal box buried approximately 3 feet underground. Inside was a collection of letters and legal documents bearing Josiah Webb's signature, along with those of several prominent Montgomery families. According to the construction foreman's report, these documents were turned over to the County Historical Society, but when researchers from the Alabama Historical Commission attempted to locate them in 1965, they were informed that no such items had ever been received. What those papers contained, whether they were the same documents that Solomon had discovered and used to psychological advantage, remains unknown. The official version of the Web Plantation's downfall attributes it to financial mismanagement and the tragic fire. But the fragments of Solomon's journal, preserved in the state archives, tell a different story, of a man who found power in knowledge, who understood that sometimes the most devastating weapon against oppression is simply the truth, held and deployed with precision. A folklore researcher interviewing elderly residents near the former Web Plantation in 1962 recorded an interesting local belief that on certain summer nights, when the air is particularly still, the sound of papers rustling can be heard in the pine forest where the main house once stood, as if someone is still there, turning pages, reading secrets aloud to the silent trees. The Webb case has been largely forgotten in official Alabama histories, overshadowed by larger events of the era. But in certain academic circles, it represents a remarkable instance of resistance that required no physical violence, only the strategic use of knowledge as power. From Dr. Eleanor Michaels's 1968 paper on antebellum power dynamics, the Webb case, while sparsely documented, suggests that even within the brutally oppressive system of slavery, there existed moments where the traditional power balance could be destabilized through unexpected means. The psychological warfare apparently employed by the enslaved man, identified as Solomon, represents a form of resistance that left few physical traces, but nonetheless brought down an entire socio-economic structure centered on a single plantation. Today, nothing remains of the Webb estate except notations in property records and the fragments of Solomon's journal, pages that somehow survived the fire, preserved by hands unknown until they made their way to the state archives more than a century later. The last surviving page, partially burned along one edge, contains only a single line. "In the end, it was not the strength of my back, but the power of my mind that made me free." Visitors to Montgomery today pass within miles of where these events transpired, the land now covered by strip malls and housing developments. Nothing marks the spot where a psychological battle of wills once toppled a man who thought himself untouchable. Nothing except perhaps the occasional unexplained feeling experienced by some who pass through the area, a sensation described by one resident in 1966 as the feeling of being watched by someone who knows something about you that you thought was hidden. Some truths remain buried, but others find their way to the surface, waiting for someone to discover them, to understand their power, and perhaps to use them to change the world in ways that might otherwise seem impossible. In 1969, a doctoral student at Tuskegee University named Marcus Johnson began researching antebellum resistance strategies among enslaved people in central Alabama. His work led him to the fragments of Solomon's journal and to a discovery that had been overlooked by previous researchers, a series of small marks in the margins of certain pages, marks that appeared to be some form of cipher. According to Johnson's dissertation, completed in 1971 but never published, these marks corresponded to specific documents in Webb's possession. Solomon appears to have created a cataloging system, Johnson wrote. allowing him to track which information could be leveraged against which members of Montgomery society. This suggests a level of strategic thinking that goes far beyond what most historical accounts attribute to enslaved individuals. Johnson's research uncovered additional court records from 1842, showing that in the months after Webb's death, several prominent Montgomery families abruptly sold properties and relocated to other states. One family, the Hendersons, who had been closely associated with Webb in business dealings, departed for Texas so quickly that they left behind valuable furniture and personal items, according to estate auction notices published in the Montgomery Advertiser. "The pattern suggests a contagion of fear," Johnson wrote, "as if Webb's death had not contained whatever secret threatened his standing, but rather had somehow released it into wider circulation." Perhaps most intriguingly, Johnson discovered a series of anonymous letters sent to certain Montgomery businesses and families in October and November of 1841. These letters, preserved in the private collection of the Willingham family until they donated them to the archives in 1953, contained no explicit threats or accusations. Instead, they simply contained phrases like, "The truth remains," or "What was hidden is now seen," or most pointedly, "Webb was just the beginning." The handwriting in these letters was never conclusively matched to Solomon's journal, but Johnson noted similarities in certain letter formations and in the pressure applied to the paper. One particularly significant document uncovered by Johnson was a partial list of names and amounts, apparently torn from a ledger. The list included several of Montgomery's most respected citizens, alongside sums of money and dates. Johnson's analysis suggested this might have been part of an illegal scheme involving the smuggling of enslaved people after the official end of the international slave trade in 1808. If accurate, Johnson wrote, this document would implicate nearly a quarter of Montgomery's elite in criminal activity that carried severe penalties. The possession of such information would have given Solomon extraordinary leverage, not just over Webb, but potentially over the entire power structure of the city. In April 1972, just as Johnson was preparing to publish his expanded findings in the Journal of Southern History, he accepted a teaching position at a university in California. His research on the Webb case was never completed. When contacted in 1978 by another researcher interested in the case, Johnson declined to discuss his former work, stating only that some history is better left undisturbed. The town records of Montgomery from 1841 through 1843 show another curious pattern that suggests the Webb case had wider implications than previously understood. Church attendance dropped noticeably. Social gatherings recorded in society columns became less frequent. Property transactions increased by nearly 30% compared to previous years, suggesting a significant reshuffling of assets and perhaps even a quiet exodus of certain families. A letter from Margaret Beaumont to her sister in Richmond, dated December 18, 1841, reads in part, "Montgomery society has become unbearably tense. No one speaks directly anymore. Conversations stop when new people enter a room. Mrs. Henderson departed last week without even a farewell dinner, and the Colliers have suddenly discovered pressing business in Charleston that requires their immediate attention. I cannot help but feel we are witnessing the collapse of something, though no one will name what it is." The psychological aftermath of Webb's death and the dissolution of his estate appears to have cast a long shadow over Montgomery. Historical accounts from the period note an unusual level of paranoia among the planter class. Security measures at plantations were increased. Several planters dismissed long-serving house slaves and replaced them with new workers who had no knowledge of family business. As Dr. Catherine Winters wrote in her 1964 analysis of pre-war social patterns in Alabama, the 1842 to 1844 period in Montgomery shows a marked defensive posture among the elite. Something had shaken their confidence in the system they had built, not enough to abandon it, but enough to make them question its foundations in ways that would not be seen again until the approach of Union forces 2 decades later. The story of Solomon himself becomes more difficult to trace after the Web Plantation fire. No official record of his death exists, nor any confirmed sighting that can be verified through multiple sources. This absence has led to numerous theories and local legends. One account, recorded in the oral histories collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s, comes from Sarah Johnson, who claimed her grandfather had been enslaved on a plantation neighboring the Webb estate. According to her testimony, "My granddaddy told us about that man, Solomon, said he was different from other slaves, carried himself like he was already free in his mind. After that big fire, people said they seen him walking north along the river, carrying nothing but a small satchel. Wasn't running or hiding, just walking steady like he had somewhere important to be." Another account comes from ship records of the steamboat Magnolia, which traveled the Alabama River to Mobile and then up the Mississippi. The passenger manifest from October 3, 1841, lists a free man of color, Solomon W., among those who boarded at Montgomery. The W is particularly noteworthy, perhaps a deliberate adoption of Webb's initial, a final act of psychological appropriation. The most tantalizing clue to Solomon's fate appears in the records of the Underground Railroad station in Cincinnati. A ledger entry from late 1841 mentions assisting an educated man from Alabama who carried valuable papers. The entry notes that this individual was not seeking merely personal freedom, but carrying information of significance to many still in bondage. Whether Solomon successfully made it to free territory and what he might have done with the information he had accumulated remains one of the most compelling mysteries of the case. Some historians have speculated that he may have established contacts with abolitionists, using his knowledge to support their cause. Others suggest he may have used the information to negotiate safe passage and a new identity, effectively disappearing from history by choice. What is clear from the fragmentary evidence is that Solomon understood something profound about power, that it rests not just on physical force but on shared secrets, on the collective agreement to maintain certain fictions. By positioning himself as the holder of dangerous knowledge, he had managed to invert, however temporarily, the power dynamic that was supposed to be absolute and unchangeable. The psychological dimension of Solomon's resistance strategy represents one of the most sophisticated approaches to undermining the institution of slavery documented in pre-Civil War America. Unlike physical rebellions, which were typically met with overwhelming violence, Solomon's method attacked the system at its most vulnerable point, the minds of those who perpetuated it. In a journal entry dated just 1 week before the fire, Solomon wrote, "I have observed that Mr. Webb no longer sleeps. He paces at night. Today he asked me if I had spoken to anyone about what I know. I replied only that truth has a way of making itself known, whether we speak it aloud or not. He looked at me as if I had pronounced a death sentence. In a way, perhaps I had, not on his body, but on his certainty. And without certainty, men like him cannot function. The Web Plantation case stands as a reminder that resistance to oppression has taken many forms throughout history, some of them leaving few visible traces in the historical record. For every documented rebellion, there were countless acts of psychological resistance, strategic uses of information, and subtle undermining of power structures that never made headlines, but nonetheless shaped the course of events. By 1958, when the highway construction uncovered that metal box of documents, the story of Solomon and Josiah Webb had faded from local memory. But the psychological impact of knowledge as power, the understanding that secrets can be more valuable than gold and more dangerous than weapons, remains as relevant today as it was on a suffocating summer day in 1841, when an enslaved man decided to use the master's own words against him. In the archives of Tuskegee University, there exists a single photograph taken of the last page of Solomon's journal before it was transferred to climate-controlled storage in 1976. The page, yellowed with age and scorched along one edge, contains a final entry that was partially obscured in earlier transcriptions. Under special lighting conditions, researchers in 1974 were able to reveal additional text that had faded almost to invisibility. The complete final entry reads, "In the end, it was not the strength of my back but the power of my mind that made me free. The master's house was built on secrets. When those secrets are spoken aloud, the house cannot stand. Remember this. Whoever finds these words, the most powerful weapon is not the one that kills the body, but the one that changes what people believe about themselves and each other. That is how worlds are truly transformed." The Web Plantation land itself seems to have absorbed something of this history. Local residents have long reported unusual experiences in the pine forest that now covers the former estate grounds. A survey conducted by folklore researchers from Auburn University in 1967 documented multiple accounts of visitors experiencing sudden anxiety, the feeling of being watched or hearing what sounded like papers rustling when no wind was blowing. Rebecca Townsend, whose family farm included a small portion of the former Webb property, told researchers, "There's a spot back in those pines where nothing grows right. The soil's good enough. We tested it. But anything planted there withers. My grandfather used to say it's because the land remembers something terrible. As a child, I was strictly forbidden from playing there. My father would say, that's where the truth got buried, but it won't stay down." In 1963, a historical marker was proposed for the site, acknowledging the Web Plantation fire and the unusual legal case that followed. The proposal was rejected by the County Historical Commission on the grounds of insufficient historical significance and lack of conclusive documentation. Some local historians have suggested that influential families with long histories in Montgomery may have preferred to let the Webb case fade from public memory rather than draw attention to events that might raise uncomfortable questions about the past. Dr. Eleanor Michaels, whose 1968 paper had brought academic attention to the case, continued researching similar instances of psychological resistance throughout the South. Her work, published in 1974 as The Invisible War: Psychological Resistance in American Slavery, identified 13 other cases where enslaved individuals had used information and psychological pressure to significantly alter their circumstances. "What makes the Webb case unique," Michaels wrote, "is the scale of the collapse that followed. Most documented cases of this type of resistance resulted in individual concessions or isolated improvements in treatment. But Solomon's approach brought down an entire economic enterprise and appears to have sent ripples through the social structure of Montgomery itself. It demonstrates how fragile systems of oppression can be when their foundations, the secrets and silent agreements that maintain them, are exposed to scrutiny." The last confirmed historical reference to the Webb case comes from a letter written in 1893 by James McHenry, believed to be the son of the overseer who disappeared the night of the fire. Writing to the Montgomery Historical Society in response to an inquiry about plantation records, the younger McHenry stated, "I have no documents relating to that property or time. My father impressed upon me only one thing about his years in Alabama, that knowledge in the wrong hands can be more dangerous than any weapon, and that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. I recommend you direct your historical interests elsewhere." Today, as highways and subdivisions cover much of what was once the Webb Plantation, The physical traces of this history have been largely erased. But the psychological truth that Solomon understood remains as powerful as ever, that systems of oppression depend on silence, on shared pretense, on the agreement not to see what is plainly visible. His most profound act of resistance was not setting fire to buildings or inciting violence, but simply positioning himself as one who sees and knows. By becoming the holder of dangerous knowledge, by refusing to pretend ignorance, he created an intolerable situation for those whose power depended on maintaining certain fictions. He understood that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to acknowledge the truth that everyone has agreed to ignore. Solomon's ultimate fate remains unknown, but the ripples of his resistance, the psychological warfare he waged against an entire system, continue to offer a powerful lesson about the nature of oppression and the unexpected ways it can be challenged. His story, preserved in fragments and whispers, reminds us that history is not just made through grand battles and dramatic confrontations, but also through quiet moments of psychological insight. When someone realizes that knowledge itself can be the most powerful weapon of all. As a final note, in 1969, during renovations to one of Montgomery's oldest churches, workers discovered a small leather pouch sealed inside a hollow space in the altar. The pouch contained a single sheet of paper with a list of names, many of them belonging to prominent families of antebellum Montgomery, and a brief message written in a careful, educated hand. The truth is never truly buried. It waits, like a seed in darkness, for the right moment to emerge into light. The handwriting was never officially compared to the fragments of Solomon's journal. The document was reported missing from church records less than a week after its discovery. Perhaps somewhere, in an archive or attic or buried box, more of Solomon's words wait to be found. Or perhaps, like so many who resisted oppression through means that left few physical traces, his most significant legacy lives on not in documents, but in the understanding he represented, that power built on secrets will always remain vulnerable to those who learn those secrets and refuse to be complicit in maintaining them. On certain summer nights, when the air over Alabama hangs heavy and still, locals say you can sometimes hear the sound of pages turning in the pine forest where the Web Plantation once stood. Not a sound of violence or vengeance, but something more powerful, the quiet, persistent sound of truth refusing to remain buried.